The music box discovery. The morning light filtered through cracked windows of what had once been the Meridian Cultural Center, casting long shadows across scattered sheet music and overturned piano benches. Nora Blackwell stepped carefully through. The debris, her worn boots crunching on fragments of glass that had once protected priceless instruments. 3 months had passed since the ceasefire, but the building still held the ghost of melodies that would never be played again. As the newly appointed coordinator for the Eastern District's Refugee Resettlement Program, Nora had volunteered to survey damaged buildings for potential housing. The irony wasn't lost on her. She, who had once filled concert halls with Chopin and Rachmaninoff, now spent her days cataloging ruins. Her fingers, once nimble across ivory keys, now held clipboards and carried boxes of basic supplies. She paused. Beside the remains of a grand piano, its lid blown clean off, strings scattered like metallic confetti. A familiar ache settled in her chest. Music had been her language, her breath, her heartbeat. Now it felt like speaking to the dead. A faint tinkling sound made her freeze. The melody was delicate, almost ethereal, a music box playing somewhere. In the rubble, Nora followed the sound, stepping over collapsed ceiling beams and navigating around piles of broken instruments. The tune was hauntingly familiar, though she couldn't place it immediately. It reminded her of something from childhood, a lullaby perhaps, or a folk song her grandmother might have hummed. Behind what remained of the ticket booth, partially buried under a fallen banner advertising the center's final concert series, she found it, a small, ornate music box with intricate silver engravings, its lid cracked but still functional. The tiny ballerina inside continued her eternal pirouette, arms raised gracefully as the melody played on. Nora knelt and carefully extracted the music box from the debris. As she lifted it, something fell from beneath, a small water-stained program from a recital 3 years ago. Evening of Contemporary Composers. It read, featuring works by local musicians. One name was circled in faded blue ink. Variations on a Childhood Memory by T. Reed. The melody began to slow as the spring wound down. Nora turned the key gently, and the song resumed, filling the broken space with something beautiful and alive. She had heard thousands of pieces in her career, but this simple tune carried something different, a quality of longing that spoke directly to the part of her that still grieved for everything they'd lost. On the inside of the music box lid, engraved in delicate script, were the words, "For my dearest T, may you always remember the song of home. Your devoted V." Nora closed her eyes and let the melody wash over her. Somewhere in this ruined city, someone was missing this music box, someone who had once been loved enough to receive such a thoughtful gift. The piece felt too personal, too precious to have been abandoned willingly. She made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of adding the music box to the inventory of salvageable items, she slipped it into her jacket pocket. For the first time since the war had stolen her music, she felt a spark of purpose that had nothing to do with housing forms or supply distributions. Someone, somewhere, was waiting for this melody to find its way home. The search through silence. Felix Torrence's fingers moved across the radio dials with practiced precision. The only sound in his cramped communications were the soft static of empty frequencies. He had learned to find meaning in silence, both the kind that filled the airwaves and the kind that had claimed his voice. 6 months ago, when shrapnel tore through his throat during the final bombardment of the communications tower, the underground facility buzzed with quiet activity as other technicians worked to restore the city's communication networks. Felix coordinated through hand signals and hastily scrawled notes, his reputation for intercepting coded enemy transmissions during the war having earned him respect despite his inability to speak. But today, something different had captured his attention. Nora Blackwell had visited the communications center that morning, carrying a small music box and asking if anyone recognized the melody. She had hummed it softly, her voice carrying the trained precision of someone who understood music's architecture. Felix had felt something stir in his memory, not of the tune itself, but of its rhythm, its distinctive pattern of notes that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. After she left, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had encountered this melody before, not as music, but as something else entirely. Felix pulled out his war journal, pages filled with frequency logs, coded transmissions, and cipher patterns he had decoded during the conflict. His role had been to monitor underground resistance communications, tracking the subtle ways rebel groups had hidden messages in seemingly innocent broadcasts. He flipped through months of entries until he found what he was looking for. During the war's final phase, an underground network had used a distinctive audio signature to mark their transmissions, melody played backwards and layered with static. He had noted it repeatedly, but never decoded its significance, assuming it was merely a recognition signal. Felix connected his vintage recording equipment to the radio array and began searching through archived transmissions. The bunker servers held thousands of hours of intercepted communications, most of them routine military chatter or propaganda broadcasts. But buried in the static of frequency 87.3, he found traces of something extraordinary. The melody from the music box, played in fragments, woven through what appeared to be evacuation coordinates and safe house locations. Someone had been using this tune as more than just a signal. They had been broadcasting hope in musical form, an audible thread connecting scattered survivors across the city's underground network. Felix's pulse quickened as he isolated and cleaned the audio. The broadcasts had originated from multiple locations throughout the tunnel system beneath the city, suggesting a mobile operation. More intriguingly, the melody appeared indifferent. Variations, sometimes faster, sometimes in minor key, as if the broadcaster had been improvising emotional layers onto the basic tune. He pulled up the city's tunnel maps and began cross-referencing the transmission points with known safe routes used during the evacuation. A pattern emerged. The broadcasts had followed the old subway lines, particularly the abandoned sections that had been closed for years before the war. Someone had been moving through those tunnels, using the music box melody as both a calling card and a lifeline for people trying to escape. Felix reached for his communication pad and wrote rapidly. Found something. Music box melody used in resistance broadcasts during evacuation. Source moved through subway tunnels. May still be active. He paused, stylus hovering over the pad. The implications were staggering. If someone had been using this melody as a survival signal, and if Nora had found the actual music box in the ruins, then the broadcaster might still be alive, still moving through the city's underground arteries. Felix gathered his equipment and headed for the surface. He needed to find Nora and convince her to follow this digital breadcrumb trail into the depths of the city. The melody had survived the war for a reason, had been carried through darkness and danger by someone who understood its power to connect and comfort. For the first time since losing his voice, Felix felt he had something crucial to communicate, not with words, but with the silent language of hope that lived in the spaces. Between notes, retry UB. Echoes in the underground. Myra Santos knew the city's underground better than anyone who had survived the war. 23 years operating subway trains had taught her every tunnel, every forgotten maintenance shaft, every echo that bounced differently when the passages were occupied. Now, 3 months after the last train would ever run these rails, she guided people through the darkness for different reasons. The Refugee Resettlement Office had been skeptical when she volunteered as an underground guide, but Myra's knowledge proved invaluable for reaching survivors who had taken shelter in the deepest parts of the tunnel system. Some were too frightened to surface, others too injured to climb the long emergency stairwells. Myra brought them food, medical supplies, and most importantly, news that the fighting had ended. When Felix and Nora found her at the old Central Station platform, Mira was preparing for another descent. Her headlamp cast stark shadows across the tiled walls that had once displayed cheerful advertisements for department stores and theaters. Now they were covered with hand-drawn maps and messages left by people searching for lost family members. Felix showed her his notes about the radio transmissions, while Nora let the music box play its haunting melody. The sound echoed strangely in the cavernous space, seeming to stretch and bend around the curved walls. Mira closed her eyes and listened, letting the tune trigger the deep memory that came from years of moving through these tunnels. "I remember," she said quietly. Not the song exactly, but someone who hummed it. Mira led them to the edge of the platform, where emergency track lighting still functioned in patches. She pointed down the main tunnel toward the abandoned sections. During the evacuations, I was running extra cars to get people out of the city center. Completely packed families with everything they could carry. Injured people, children who wouldn't stop crying. She paused, watching shadows dance across the tunnel walls. There was this young man, maybe early 20s. He had some kind of injury to his hands. They were bandaged, looked like burns maybe. But he kept humming this tune, over and over. Very softly, like he was trying not to disturb anyone, but I could hear it from the operator's cab. Felix wrote rapidly. Did he get off at a station? That's what was strange, Mira continued. He rode all the way to the end of the line, past the official evacuation stops, past the last functioning station. When we reached the abandoned Riverside terminal, he asked if I could let him off there. I wasn't supposed to, but... She shrugged. Everything was chaos. Normal rules didn't matter anymore. Nora clutched the music box tighter. Did he say why he wanted to go there? He said he was looking for someone who would recognize the song. Mira picked up her equipment pack and adjusted the straps. I remember thinking it was foolish. Those deep tunnels were dangerous even before the war. But he seemed certain, like he knew exactly where he was going. The three of them descended into the tunnel system, following the old subway route toward Riverside. Mira's headlamp illuminated patches of the journey, abandoned platforms where makeshift camps had been established and then deserted, maintenance alcoves filled with forgotten supplies, stretches where the ceiling had partially collapsed, but remained passable. As they walked deeper, the urban sounds from above faded completely. The only noises were their footsteps, the distant drip of water, and occasionally the music box melody when Nora wound it to keep their spirits up. Each time it played, Mira noticed how the sound seemed to travel differently, sometimes echoing. For long moments, sometimes absorbed quickly by the tunnel walls. The acoustics change based on what's ahead, Mira explained when Felix wrote a question about it. Empty spaces make the sound bounce. Blocked passages swallow it. But there's something else when there are people nearby. Music carries differently. The human body absorbs and reflects sound in specific ways. They reached a junction where the main tunnel split into 3 directions. Mira consulted her hand-drawn map, but Felix was already kneeling beside the tracks, examining something. He held up a fragment of torn fabric dark blue wool that looked like it had come from a coat or sweater. This wasn't here when I came through last week, Mira said, studying the scrap. Someone's been using this route recently. Nora wound the music box again, and this time the melody seemed to pull toward the leftmost tunnel, the one that led deepest into the abandoned system. As the notes faded, they heard something impossible, a faint harmonic response, as if the tunnel itself was singing back. Mira smiled for the first time that day. That's not an echo, she said. Someone down there is answering. The silent symphony, the deepest level of the abandoned Riverside terminal, had been closed to passengers for over a decade before the war began. Water damage and structural concerns had made it unsafe for regular use. But the platforms remained intact, a vast, cathedral-like space with vaulted ceilings that created perfect acoustic resonance. In the farthest corner of this forgotten chamber, Tobias Reed had built his sanctuary. At 19, Tobias had already composed more music than most people heard in a lifetime, despite or perhaps because of being born completely deaf. His world was one of vibrations, visual patterns, and the mathematics of harmony that he felt through his fingertips and saw in the structured movements of sound waves. A war had driven him underground, but the tunnels had given him something unexpected, the perfect concert hall for music no one else could hear. His composition station was an intricate assembly of salvaged materials. Speakers connected to visualization software translated his work into rippling patterns of light across multiple screens. Drums made from repurposed metal containers let him feel the bass rhythms through the floor. A keyboard he had rewired to produce both sound and corresponding vibrations allowed him to craft melodies he experienced as physical sensations traveling up his arms. For months, Tobias had been working on his most ambitious piece, a memorial symphony for everyone the city had lost. He called it the Silent Symphony because it was designed to be felt as much as heard, accessible to both the hearing and deaf members of the community he hoped would someday gather to experience it together. But the symphony remained incomplete. There was a melodic phrase that haunted the edges of his consciousness, pattern he could almost grasp but never quite capture. He had tried hundreds of variations, but nothing felt right. The missing piece lived somewhere between memory and imagination, a ghost melody that seemed essential to the work's emotional core. When the faint vibrations of approaching footsteps reached him through the platform floor, Tobias initially assumed it was another refugee seeking shelter. But then came something else, a delicate tremor in the air that he recognized immediately as music. Not the heavy, percussive beats he usually worked with, but something ethereal and complex. He watched his visualization screens light up with the incoming audio pattern. The melody was simple but sophisticated, with mathematical relationships that spoke to something deep in his compositional understanding. As the music box played, Tobias felt the familiar electric sensation that came when scattered musical ideas suddenly aligned into perfect harmony. This was the missing piece. Tobias stood and began walking toward the sound, his bare feet sensitive to every vibration traveling through the concrete floor. His screens followed his movement via wireless connection, continuing to display the visual representation of the melody as it grew stronger. The pattern was beautiful waves of light that seemed to breathe with organic rhythm. When Mira, Felix, and Nora emerged from the tunnel entrance, they found a young man standing in a space that looked like a cross between a recording studio and an art installation. Screens everywhere showed flowing patterns of colored light, while speakers and makeshift instruments created a landscape of creative possibility. Tobias stood motionless, watching the music box's melody dance across his displays. Nora approached, slowly, still carrying the music box. When she saw Tobias's setup, she understood immediately. Here was someone who experienced music the way she once had, as a living language with its own grammar and poetry. Tobias turned to face them, and his hands began moving in rapid sign language. Felix, who had learned basic signing after losing his voice, translated for the others. He says the melody you're carrying is the piece he's been searching for. It completes something he's been trying to finish. Tobias gestured toward his screens, where he had begun layering harmonic structures beneath the music box tune. The simple melody transformed before their eyes into something richer and more complex, surrounded by complementary voices that supported and enhanced its emotional impact. Then, Tobias signed something that made Felix pause before translating. He asks if you know who composed this melody. He says it feels like family, like something written by someone who understands music the same way he does. Nora looked at the engraving inside the music box lid. For my dearest T, may you always remember the song of home. Your devoted. V. Her hands trembled as she showed the inscription to Tobias. His eyes widened as he read, and then his own hands began to shake. He signed rapidly, tears streaming down his face. When music heals the broken, the abandoned platform transformed in the hours that followed. Tobias's recognition of his sister's gift. What had been a solitary workspace became a gathering place as word spread through the underground network that something extraordinary was happening in the deepest tunnel. Refugees emerged from hidden alcoves, aid workers descended from the surface, and even some of the city officials who had been skeptical of underground rehabilitation efforts made the long journey down. Nora sat beside Tobias at his composition station, watching him weave his sister's simple melody into the larger tapestry of his memorial symphony. His hands moved across the modified keyboard with fluid grace, each note creating ripples of colored light across the screens that surrounded them. She found herself able to read his visual music language intuitively, her years of classical training translating seamlessly into this new way of experiencing sound. Felix had connected his radio equipment to Tobias's system, broadcasting the evolving composition to receivers placed throughout the tunnel network. People who had been isolated in the depths for months suddenly found themselves connected by waves of music that traveled through the darkness, carrying messages of hope and remembrance. Mira worked with a growing group of volunteers to prepare the platform for what Tobias had envisioned as a memorial concert. They strung lights salvaged from various parts of the tunnel system, creating a warm glow that softened the harsh concrete edges of the space. Seating areas were arranged so that both hearing and deaf audience members could experience the performance. Fully some positioned near speakers for optimal audio, others placed where they could feel vibrations through the floor and watch the visual displays. As the sun set somewhere far above them, casting the underground world into its familiar twilight, the performance began. Tobias had titled the completed work Variations on Coming Home, incorporating not just his sister's melody, but musical elements that represented each person who had helped bring it back to him. Nora's section was a classical interpretation of the main theme, played on a piano that volunteers had somehow managed to lower into the tunnels piece by piece. Her fingers found their voice again as she performed, the melody flowing through her hands with the same natural ease she had thought lost forever. The music filled the vaulted space with crystalline clarity, each note hanging in the air before blending with the next. Felix's contribution was a soundscape of the radio, frequencies where Violet's coded melody had lived during the war. He had composed a piece from the static and whispered transmissions, creating an electronic symphony that told the story of messages traveling through darkness, of hope transmitted across impossible distances. Though he could not sing, his equipment became his voice, speaking in the language of radio waves and electrical impulses. Mira's movement was woven throughout the rhythm of feet on platform tiles, the rumble of phantom trains, the sound of footsteps echoing through corridors. She had choreographed a piece that used the tunnel system itself as an instrument, with volunteers positioned throughout the underground network, creating percussion from the architecture around them. But it was Tobias's section that brought everyone to tears. Using his sister's melody as the foundation, he built layers of harmony that represented everyone the city had lost, not as an ending, but as voices joining a continuing conversation. The deaf audience members felt the music as physical sensation, while the visual displays created a light show that painted stories across the tunnel walls. As the symphony reached its crescendo, something unexpected happened. Voices began joining from the audience, people humming along with melodies they recognized, adding their own harmonies to the composition. The strict boundaries between performer and audience dissolved as the music became a collective expression of survival, loss, and the stubborn persistence of beauty in the face of destruction. When the final notes faded, the applause was thunderous, echoing through the tunnels and up toward the surface. But more than the sound, it was the feeling in the space that marked the moment as transformative. For the first time since the war ended, the underground felt like a place where life was happening, not just being endured. Tobias stood and signed. To the audience, with Felix translating, "My sister Violet always said that music doesn't really belong to the person who writes it. It belongs to everyone who needs to hear it." Tonight, her melody found its way home to all of us. Nora approached Tobias and gently placed the music box in his hands. As he wound the key and let the simple tune play one more time, she noticed that it sounded different. Now, not because the mechanism had changed, but because they had changed. The melody that had once seemed like a relic of something lost now felt like the beginning of something new. Above them, the city continued its slow work of rebuilding. But below ground, in the tunnels where people had learned to find each other in the darkness, the music played on a bridge between silence and sound, between loss and discovery, between the family that war had scattered and the community that music had helped them become.